Welcome to another edition of Daily Airline News, focusing on the tragic loss of Air India Flight 171. I am Jeffrey Thomas, and I'm delighted to say joined once again by my co-host Richard Godfrey in Frankfurt. Good morning to you, Richard.
And good afternoon to you, Jeffrey.
So, Richard, today the episode is called Not the Captain. Factual information on the captain has been included in the preliminary report. It has been widely reported that the investigation has been widened to include medical and psychological subject matter experts. The media are full of the fuel switch controversy, mental health and motive speculation, investigation processes and transparency issues. Indian pilot unions and commentators argue the Western media has rushed to blame the captain. They assert the story unfairly vilifies a respected and experienced aviator with minimal direct evidence. Interviews and tributes from colleagues describe the captain as calm, meticulous and soft-spoken. Fellow pilots and associations emphasise his professionalism, experience and integrity, arguing that he would not have been likely to intentionally harm the flight. Newsweek headline reads, "Stop trying to rationalise murder-suicide." Newsweek quotes Germanwings 9525 and SilkAir 185, which were in the cruise phase when one pilot locked the other out of the cockpit and the perpetrator pilot was known to have clinical depression. First Officer Andrew Libetz had documented clinical depression, multiple psychiatric consultations and concealed medical unfitness from his employer. Captain Su Wei Ming had financial stress, disciplinary issues and possible depression. CVR and FDR both stopped recording shortly before the plunge. Intentional circuit breaker pulls, which Captain Su Wei Ming had done before and was disciplined for covering up evidence. Two aviation experts we really admire are more cautious, but they say pilot error is a likely cause. Greg Feith stated that the Indian Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau, the AAIB, is treating the crash as a potential intentional act, not just an accident. He emphasised this characterisation aligns with other tragedies like SilkAir, Germanwings or Egypt Air, where deliberate actions were confirmed. Greg Feith said, "Somebody had to have seen that action to make that statement. You just wouldn't have a dual engine failure." David Learmount from Flight International said, "Pilot error under stress is unlikely, but possible." What is the fuel switch controversy, Richard? What do we know for sure?
Well, there is no transcript or audio file from the cockpit voice recorder, so we're left in the dark a bit. The cockpit conversations and the cockpit sounds could have been included in the preliminary report because the data was successfully downloaded. Instead, we're given two sentences which are described as follows. In the cockpit voice recording, one of the pilots is heard asking the other, "Why did he cut off?" And the other pilot responded that he did not do so. There is no mention of when this conversation took place, and there is no mention of what this conversation was referring to. When one pilot says cut off, what was cut off? So what I think is the first officer's instruments and displays would have been cut off when the main AC electrical power fails on both engines. So when that happens, the main battery takes over until the RAT is deployed. And the first officer's instruments and displays are cut off. The captains are still active. So it's not a surprise to me that the first officer would then say, "Why did you cut off?" And the captain would say, "I did not do so." So if we knew when this conversation took place, then we would be enlightened. But the investigators know exactly when this conversation took place, and we are not told in the preliminary report. And I have to ask the question, why is this crucial information regarding the timing of this pilot conversation left out of the preliminary report? We are given other information, which is actually irrelevant. For example, we are told that checks on the fuel switches, according to the FAA Special Airworthiness Information Bulletin, dated 2018, were carried out on this aircraft. But we're then told that the whole unit, including the fuel control switches, was replaced in 2023. So that makes the 2018 SAIB irrelevant. We're also told that both fuel control switches were found in the run position. That's after the crash had taken place, and who knows what happened during the crash. So it's all a bit of a mystery, this fuel switch controversy.
So this begs the question, Richard, whether the fuel switches were moved at all.
It does indeed. And, again, we're left in the dark. What we are told in the preliminary report, the aircraft achieved the maximum recorded airspeed of 180 knots IAS at about 08:08:42. And immediately thereafter, engine 1 and engine 2 fuel cutoff switches transitioned from run to cutoff. And there was a gap of around 1 second between the two switches. Some have said it's actually not possible within 1 second to move both switches, but I won't go into that argument. The preliminary report says engine N1 and N2, it doesn't say which engine, but presumably both, began to decrease from their takeoff values as the fuel supply to the engines was cut off. And the first implication from that statement is that both engine shutdowns were a direct result of the fuel switches being transitioned to cut off. Well, I'm not sure that that implication is correct. And I would say that the RAT was deployed before the fuel switches were cut off, and we've shown our argument for that. And the second implication from the statement is that the maximum airspeed of 180 knots is exactly what you would expect to see at 08:08:42 if the engines were both shut down at 08:08:43 or 08:08:44, and that's a second or two after, then I'm sorry, it just doesn't add up. The maximum airspeed must have been much higher than 180 knots and achieved 2, 3, or 4 seconds later. And we are told, as per the EAFR, the engine 1 fuel cutoff switch transitioned from cutoff to run at 08:08:52. And thereafter, the engine 2 fuel switch was moved from cutoff to run at 08:08:56. We are not told, as per the EAFR, when engine 1 and engine 2 fuel cutoff switches were transitioned from run to cutoff. Was it at 08:08:42 or 43 or 44? The preliminary report is just vague on this point. And if both engines shut down was a result of the fuel switches, then why do they say the maximum airspeed achieved was 180, not 187, or maybe even much higher? Some people have calculated even above 200 knots. And why did it occur at 08:08:42? It should have been at least 2 seconds, if not 4 seconds later.
Richard, no analysts dispute the fact that the rat was deployed. So what does that tell us?
Well, it essentially tells us that there was either an emergency situation actually taking place, in which case the rat would be automatically deployed, or that the pilots considered or perceived that an emergency situation would be taking place very soon, and they then manually deployed the rat. So, one way or the other, there was an emergency situation. And I think everyone can agree, since the aircraft crashed, there definitely was an emergency situation.
But wouldn't you start the APU if an emergency situation was perceived to be taking place or likely to be soon taking place?
Yes, exactly. And that's the key point. And we're told that the APU inlet door began opening at about 08:08:54, and that was consistent with the APU auto start logic.
Now, that was 12 seconds after the maximum airspeed was reached at 08:08:42, was it not?
Yeah, and that's the key fact. So the APU auto start was a consequence of losing both engines and losing airspeed. And it, as you point out, happened 12 seconds after the maximum airspeed was reached. And based on our analysis of the ADS-B data, the RAT came online just after the last ADS-B message at 08:08:50.871 UTC. If the RAT came online electrically at 08:08:52 or thereabouts, that is exactly the time that engine one fuel switch was moved back to run. And it's 2 seconds later that the APU auto start commenced. And it was 2 seconds later after the APU starting that the engine two fuel switch was moved back to run. We know for a fact the pilots would have known that the main battery only supports a single engine restart, but not a dual engines restart. So the pilots would have known they had to wait for the RAT in order to support a dual engine restart. The pilots also would have known that the APU uh, is a useful backup and also supports a dual engine restart.
So, Richard, at what point would the captain have taken control of the aircraft in this situation?
So on a Boeing 787-8, the all electrical powered aircraft, if all AC power is lost, the captain must take over flying because only his instruments and displays are supported by the main battery. And he at least has to take over until the RAT electrical power comes online. And the power distribution system then switches back from main battery to the RAT essential bus. This is not a command prerogative. This is a technical necessity.
Mm. So the captain had to be the pilot flying for around 10 seconds, whilst the sole electrical supply was the main battery.
Exactly. And when the RAT comes online, then the first officer's instruments and displays are restored. But the head-up displays for both the captain and the first officer are not powered by the RAT. So the captain made a Mayday call at 080905, which is 13 seconds after the RAT deployed and 9 seconds after both fuel switches were moved back to run. And on the basis of aviate, navigate, communicate, then the captain handed control back to the first officer once his instruments and displays were back on. And the captain was flying for around 10 seconds at least, maybe a bit longer, and then handed over to the first officer as the pilot flying and said, "Your aircraft," and the first officer would say, "My aircraft." Then the captain would focus on ensuring both engine restart sequences were successful. And then he communicated his Mayday call. And all of that took place in a space of 23 seconds. That is, in my view, the best which is humanly possible, and is certainly not a man desperate to intentionally crash the aircraft. The aircraft crashed 1,620 meters from the end of the runway. And this was only possible because the pilot achieved some thrust. Unfortunately, not enough thrust to save the aircraft.
Yeah.
Let me ask you a question, Jeffrey. You've studied all the aircraft incidents where pilots deliberately crashed the aircraft. What moment was chosen and why?
Well, yeah. It was usually in cruise when the other pilot left the cockpit and the remaining pilot would lock the door and crash into the ocean or a remote mountainous area. Yeah, that's the usual scenario that I've been that has happened over the last 20 or 30 years.
So, has this sort of incident ever happened straight after takeoff, when the aircraft crashed into a densely populated area, then also killing people on the ground?
Look, not to my knowledge at all. Of course, 9/11 it killed a lot of people on the ground, but that was because of a particular set of buildings were targeted and coordinated. But that wasn't immediately after takeoff. That was that the aircraft had been well on their way before being diverted back. There has never been a pilot who intentionally crashed a single commercial aircraft to take his own life and that of his passengers in a densely populated area in the history of aviation, to my knowledge, anyway. Richard, what's your conclusion then?
Yeah. The captain is reported as saying to his father, "I will call you when I reach London." And also saying, "I'm going to be leaving my job now or soon and take care of you." If these reports are factual, it does not sound like a desperate individual who performed a deliberate act to crash the aircraft. And when you go through the time sequence, I think the captain and the first officer were doing everything humanly possible to try and save the aircraft. And it all rolled out in a very short space of time, around 23 seconds. So my conclusion is it was not the captain and it was not the first officer.
No, I agree with you. If the actual terminology is correct, as reported, thrust not achieved, that doesn't sound like someone taking their life and those of the passengers on board. It just doesn't make sense, that comment at all. And of course, as we have identified, as you have identified, the mathematics of all this just don't add up. It just does not seem to be credible that it would be a deliberate act.
Yeah.
Mm.
Indeed. And I think the vagueness of the preliminary report, especially around the cutoff statement, is, well, designed to confuse the general public, and it has successfully confused the general public.
Well, except for MH370, I don't think there's ever been an air crash that has caused so much controversy and division as to the cause of it. Of course, obviously the MAX crashes as well, I should add, have also caused a lot of division. But this is quite extraordinary, this one. So, Richard, thank you very much indeed for your work on this. Certainly a fascinating episode, and it really does reinforce that, in our view, it was not the captain.
Indeed, it does. And
Yeah.
we look forward to the many questions and comments that we will no doubt receive, because this subject has divided opinion, and there are many pro and many contra the view that it was not the captain.
Mm. So, viewers, that's all we've got time for today. As Richard suggests, we expect there'll be a lot of comments for and against this particular episode. We plan to be back tomorrow, but it will be at a later time than that you've been regularly used to. So bear with us on that. But we do plan to come back tomorrow to answer your questions. So please subscribe to us if you haven't already. Please like us. Please keep those wonderful supportive comments coming. We really do appreciate them. And keep those wonderful questions coming, even the challenging ones. We're up for it. So thank you again, Richard.
You're welcome.
And thank you for viewers for tuning in. Thank you for joining us. And please do tune in tomorrow. We look forward to your company. Thank you.